Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Then Al-Hafiz said, Kitab al-Hudud, the book of Hudud. Hudud is the plural of had, and had means a limit or a boundary. So for example, the border of a country is a had. But had does not have to be a physical boundary, it could mean in terms of halal and haram. So that which is haram, then these actions have a boundary around it, so you're not allowed to trespass that boundary. And this is where Allah Jalla wa Ala says, تِلْكَ حُدُودُ اللَّهِ فَلَا تَقْرَبُوهَا. These are the hudud, or the limits of Allah, so do not even approach them. Meaning don't come near to violating what Allah Jalla wa Ala has made haram. Al-had can also mean a clear definition of a word. For example, what is the had of the word at-tahara, which translates to purity, but in terms of giving a definition which includes everything which is purity and discludes everything which is not technically purity. So if you were to give a description of wudu, let's say, and you were to say it is to use water on the 4 body parts, which are of course the hands up to the elbows, the face, wiping of the head, and washing the feet up to the ankles, then this would not be a had of at-tahara. Why? Well, because you have not included at-tayammum and al-ghusl in this. And at-tayammum and al-ghusl are from at-tahara. Or for example, if you ask what is tahara and somebody was to say, it is when you clean your clothes from any dirt or impurity and you wash your face and hands after you sleep, then this is not a had of at-tahara because you have not included many other things which are part of tahara. So a had is a clear-cut definition which includes everything which comes under this definition and excludes everything which is not from this definition. Similarly, if somebody was to ask you, what is wajib? And you were to reply, well, wajib is something which Allah orders you to do. Is this a valid had of wajib in the technical sense? No, it is not, because Allah could order you to do things which are not wajib, they are mustahab. So in this definition of yours, you've included something which does not belong in the category of wajib. And the had is that you're not allowed to do that. And if you were to give a had, you'd have to exclude that which is mustahab. This is the whole point of a had. So the word had could have many meanings. However, in this chapter of fiqh, the word had means a prescribed punishment from the Sharia for a specific sin in order to prevent this sin from occurring in society, so it's a deterrent, and in order to expiate the sin of the doer. So from this definition, we find that there are 2 purposes for the had punishments. Number 1 is a deterrent, and number 2, it is a kafara for the one who has fallen into this specific sin. And when we say it is prescribed in the Sharia, it means to say that we find evidence for it in the Sharia, in the text of the Sharia. So it must not be based on somebody's ijtihad, for example. And of course there are many sins that can be performed, but not all of them have a had punishment. Only a handful of sins, which we shall discuss, have a had punishment prescribed for them. And it is for this reason of the kafara that we do not include the punishment of the apostate from the had punishments, because if a person dies as a kafir, he does not have a kafara for his sin, because of course we know kuffar will be in Jahannam forever, so there is no kafara for them. The whole idea of the kafara is that it expiates your sins, so that you are not punished for them in the hereafter. What is the evidence that the had punishments are a kafara for your sin? Well, we do have a good general evidence found in the Sahih, in which the Prophet ﷺ said to his companions, when they were giving the pledge of allegiance to him, he told them, تُبَايِعُونَنِي عَلَىٰ أَنْ لَا تُشْرِكُوا بِاللَّهِ شَيْئًا وَلَا تَزْنُوا وَلَا تَسْرِقُوا وَلَا تَقْتُلُوا النَّفْسَ الَّتِي حَرَّمَ اللَّهُ إِلَّا بِالْحَقِّ فَمَنْ وَفَّى مِنْكُمْ فَأَجْرُهُ عَلَى اللَّهِ وَمَنْ أَصَابَ شَيْئًا مِنْ ذَلِكَ فَعُوقِبَ بِهِ فَهُوَ كَفَّارَةٌ لَهُ وَمَنْ أَصَابَ شيئا من ذلك فستره الله فأمره إلى الله إن شاء عفى عنه وإن شاء عذبه. The Prophet told them, you will give pledge of allegiance to me that you will not commit shirk with Allah, you will not fornicate, you will not steal, and you will not kill an innocent person, except with due right. So whoever keeps to this pledge of his, then his reward is with Allah. But whoever violates any of this, and he is punished thereby, then this will be a kaffara for him, an expiation for his sins. And whoever commits any of these acts, and he is not punished in this world, so Allah covers his sins, then his affair is with Allah. If Allah wants, He will forgive him on Yawm al-Qiyamah, and if He wants, He will punish him. So in this hadith, in the Sahihain, we find clear evidence that the one who commits one of these major sins, and he's punished for it, so he's given the had punishment, then this would be a kaffara for him, and he will not be punished in the hereafter. And it is for this reason that the people during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, who committed zina, which is either fornication or adultery, then they confessed to this sin. Why would you confess and accept the punishment which is so severe instead of just keeping it a secret? Well, the answer is they knew that this punishment is a kaffara for them, so they will not face the punishment in the hereafter. And of course, the punishment of the hereafter is far more severe and far longer lasting. So this is why the companions who committed zina were even prepared to die for this sin, so they could avoid the punishment in the hereafter. So we can even say that this had punishment is in fact a favor to those who have committed the sin, because it is saving them from the punishment of the hereafter, which is far more severe and far longer lasting. But of course, in order to appreciate this, you have to have Iman in the hereafter and the day of reckoning. And this is why the kuffar will never be able to understand the had punishments, because they don't have any concept of being taken into account in the hereafter. All they know is the materialistic aspects of this world. Allah Jalla wa Ala says, يَعْلَمُونَ ظَاهِرًا مِنَ الْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا وَهُمْ عَنِ الْآخِرَةِ هُمْ غَافِلُونَ. They only know what is apparent, or the superficial items of this world, and they are completely heedless of the hereafter. What is the ruling on giving out the had punishment? We say it is wajib if the case gets taken to court and is proven so. It is wajib because Allah Jalla wa Ala commands it firmly. For example, stealing is one of the punishments, sins for which there is a had punishment. Allah says, وَالسَّارِقُ وَالسَّارِقَةُ فَاقْطَعُوا أَيْدِيَهُمَا نَكَالًا مِنَ اللَّهِ وَاللَّهُ عَزِيزٌ حَكِيمٌ. And the male and female thief cut off their hands as an exemplary punishment from Allah, and Allah is the honored, the wise. So we find that these had punishments are based upon wisdom. No matter how severe they may sound, they are based upon wisdom. Because somebody might say, well, hang on a minute, a person's hand in the Sharia is cut off if he steals something which is worth a quarter of a dinar or more. But when it comes to the qisaas, then we have said that if the blood money is 1,000 dinar, then if somebody cuts off somebody else's hand, then he has to pay 500 dinar, which is half of the full blood money. So how comes then in qisaas the hand is worth 500 dinar, and in the case of stealing it is only worth a quarter of a dinar, because that's how much it can be cut off for? So they may say, where's the equality in this, and where's the wisdom in this? Clearly, this is an inconsistency. So this may appear to be inconsistent to the untrained mind, but if we look at the wisdom behind it, then we find that the hand is being cut off for a quarter of a dinar in order to protect people's wealth. And all of a sudden in qisaas it is worth 500 dinar in order to protect people's persons, the physical body. So there's a difference between the wealth and the person. And we can also say that as soon as somebody steals, then this hand of his, which would have been worth 500 dinar as the blood money, is now only worth a quarter of a dinar because of the sin which this hand is committing. It reduces your sanctity and it reduces your value. This is the effect of sin generally. It just reduces your value and your sanctity and your respect in the eyes of the people. As for the importance of the had punishment, then there is a hadith in the Sunan which has been graded da'if, where the Prophet is reported to have said, حَدٌّ يُعْمَلُ بِهِ فِي الْأَرْضِ خَيْرٌ لِأَهْلِ الْأَرْضِ مِنْ أَنْ يُمْطَرُوا 40 صَبَاحًا. That for a had punishment to be carried out on earth is better for its inhabitants than for it to rain for 40 days, and some narrations have 30 days. Also we have authentically in Sunan Abi Dawud, where the Prophet ﷺ said, مَنْ حَالَتْ شَفَاعَتُهُ دُونَ حَدٍّ مِنْ حُدُودِ اللَّهِ فهو مضاد الله في أمره. Whoever seeks to stop a had punishment by interceding against it, then he has opposed Allah in his command. So this matter is not to be taken lightly. The had punishments are severe, and because of this, Allah Jalla wa Ala explicitly states to us, do not have any mercy on the people who are entitled to the had punishment. When he talks about whipping the fornicators 100 lashes each, he tells us, وَلَا تَأْخُذْكُمْ بِهِمَا رَأْفَةٌ فِي دِينِ اللَّهِ إِن كُنتُمْ تُؤْمِنُونَ بِاللَّهِ وَالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ. And do not let your compassion overcome you in the deen of Allah, if you truly have Iman in Allah and the last day. Because you see, the one who has legislated this punishment is the one who is more merciful than you can ever be. So if he has legislated this punishment, then how can you be more merciful than him? And he's telling you, do not have mercy on these people. And this mercy that you want to show to these people is in fact not mercy. It is not called mercy, it is called weakness. You are too weak to carry out your responsibility and to do the right thing. This is weakness, it is not mercy. You only forgive and have mercy if it leads to a rectification of affairs. But if these people are committing zina, and you have mercy on them and allow them to do so, then what will this lead to? It will lead to even more zina in the land, just as we find in the kuffar countries. So then ask yourself, what was the result of this mercy of yours? Was it a rectification of affairs? No, of course not. It was a spread of corruption in the land. And this is what weakness does. And this is not something of a good consequence. Whereas mercy leads to good consequences. So notice the difference between mercy and weakness, and do not get them mixed up. Okay, so this had punishment, we know it is wajib to be performed if it gets taken to court, but on whom can it be performed? Well, there are conditions. The person on whom you are performing this had punishment needs to be baligh, which means he is an adult. And that's because the pen has been lifted from the child. Somebody who is below the age of bulugh, or adolescence, can be punished by his parents or those in authority, but the had punishment cannot be applied to him. We also know he has to be aqil, so somebody of sane mind and intellect. This is because the pen has been lifted from the insane, and of course the had punishment is the right Allah has over you. And thirdly, he has to be somebody on whom the Islamic law or the Sharia applies, so he's living in an Islamic state. And it makes no difference whether this person is a Muslim or a kafir. So the one on whom the Islamic law applies in an Islamic state would be the Muslim and the dhimmi. But as for the dhimmi, then the had is not applied to him unless he believes that that particular action is haram in his deen. So if we say that the punishment of drinking the khamr or intoxicant, which is the lashing of 40 or 80 depending on the imam's ijtihad, then if we say that this is a had punishment, and there's a difference of opinion here, but let's go with the opinion that it's a had punishment, then in this case the had punishment is not applied to him, because in his deen drinking the khamr is halal. But somebody may ask here, if the had is applied to the kafir, then we said that the had is a kafara for the sin, but we also said that a kafir does not have his sins expiated because he will be in Jahannam forever. Well, that is true. However, the had serves the other purpose as well, which is to serve as a deterrent. So even though it does not serve as an expiation for the kuffar, but it does serve as a deterrent. And so this is why the Prophet ﷺ stoned a man and a woman from the Yahud, and zina is haram in the deen of the Yahud. In fact, it is haram in all the adyan. And then the fourth condition is that he needs to know that this action is haram. But how do we know that he knows that this action is haram or not? Well, we look at the surrounding indications. If he's living in an Islamic environment with people of knowledge around him, then it's by necessity that he will know that, for example, zina is haram, or that stealing is haram. But as for somebody who is newly coming to Islam, or somebody who comes from a place where knowledge is scarce, then if he says that he did not know that zina is haram, then this is somebody whose word we can accept. Note here that we say he needs to know that it is haram. It is not a condition that he needs to know what the punishment of this haram action is. So if he says that I knew that stealing is haram, but I did not know that the punishment for this is the hand being cut off. So do we cut off this person's hand? The answer is yes. As long as he knew it was haram, this is sufficient enough. It is enough for us to know that he knew he was violating the law of Allah Jalla wa Ala through his own good free will. So who establishes this punishment then? It is the Imam or his deputy. No one else is allowed to. And when the Imam or his deputy is establishing this punishment by, let's say, whipping him, then he needs to bear in mind three things. Number one, that he is following the order of Allah Jalla wa Ala, and that he's not punishing the perpetrator for any personal reasons. The situation is far too serious for there to be any personal motives. And number two, that he intends thereby to remove the corruption in the land. Remember what we said, that the had punishment is a deterrent to corruption. And thirdly, he intends to rectify the state of the general masses, so that the people themselves who are witnessing this punishment can themselves be straightened. So these punishments serve as an exemplary punishment, so others can take an example from them and become better thereby. How is the whipping to be done? Well, it is done when the perpetrator is standing up, not lying on the ground, and neither is he sitting down. The instrument used would be a whip, and it would not be something sharp which would cause death, neither something too heavy like a hammer, because that can also cause serious injury and death. The idea is to simply inflict pain, and because of this he must not have any thick items of clothing worn, because that defeats the purpose of giving the had punishment. He can be wearing clothes, but thin item of clothing, for example a shirt or a thobe or a jubba, something which is of a thin sort. As for if it is so thick, then this defeats the purpose. He is not whipped lying down, and neither is he tied to a post or perhaps to a pole and then whipped, because if he was lying down or tied to something, then this would increase him in his punishment and in his pain, and this is not what is intended. The only pain should come from the whip. And also, he is not whipped in a naked state, so that he has to take off his top and then whipped on the back. No, he does have clothes on, but they are of a thin material. This punishment must be witnessed by a group of people. There's no upper limit, but we say that the lowest limit would be 3. This whip could be a normal whip, or it could be a branch of a tree as well. So something that will cause pain but not serious injury or death. And the had punishment is not to be established in the masjid because of the narration that we have. The Prophet forbade that the had punishments be established in the masajid, and likewise in the musalla of the Eid as well, because this takes the ruling of the masjid. The person implementing the had punishment of the whipping, what force does he apply? He applies the force so much that it does not rip the skin. So this would depend on the material of the whip, and also depends on the force. So the idea is not to make him bleed or to injure him severely, it is simply to make him taste the punishment or taste the pain. And when the punisher is flogging the perpetrator, then the lashes must be spread out all throughout the body. So he doesn't just focus on one part of the body, rather he spreads it out. So this would be all across the back, also on the legs as well. But the point is that he needs to refrain from hitting those places which are particularly delicate. So the genitalia, for example, or the head, because this could lead to brain damage, and any part which could lead to a serious injury or death. So the idea is to spread out the punishment, avoiding the sensitive areas. And the face is definitely to be avoided as well. We know that from the hadith. The Prophet ﷺ forbade striking the face. And this person being punished with the had punishment is ma'soom, so he is to be honored. And such a person, then his face must not be struck. Hitting somebody on the head lightly, other than the had punishment, is permissible. For example, a father hitting his son on the head in terms of a little light slap, then this is permissible. Obviously, nothing too heavy is allowed because this leads to brain damage. So in terms of the flick of the air or just a light slap on the head, then this doesn't do any harm. In dishing out the had punishment, the same ruling applies to women as it does to men, except some scholars have suggested that she should be sitting down because this is more concealing for her than standing up. Also, the clothing on her needs to be firmly tied, because in the lashing you don't want anything of her being exposed, whereas the issue is less serious for a man. So we say you need to make sure that the clothing is firmly tied on to the woman. And in fact, we have a narration which speaks about this issue. When the Prophet ﷺ ordered a woman to be stoned to death, it mentions that her clothing was firmly tied. If it is feared that the woman, through the pain, might rip her clothes, then her hands are to be tied as well. The lashing can also be given for a ta'zir punishment. This is any punishment which the ruler deems to be fitting for a sin for which there is no prescribed punishment. So lashing can be an option. Some scholars have said that other than the had punishment, you're not allowed to lash somebody more than 10 times because of the hadith لا يجلد فوق 10 إلا في حد من حدود الله, that nobody should be whipped more than 10 times except for one of the had punishments. But this is not the correct opinion. Rather, what is intended by the had in that hadith is a sin committed against Allah Jalla wa Ala. So what we take this hadith to be then is a man disciplining his student or child, that you don't strike them more than 10 times. So if a man has to discipline his wife or his kids, or a person disciplining his student for something terrible which they have done, for which they deserve discipline, then he's not allowed to strike them more than 10 times. But as for a had of Allah, meaning to say one of the limits of Allah, in other words, a sin committed against Allah Jalla wa Ala, then there you are allowed to strike more than 10 times. In fact, death could be a possible ta'zir as well. So if death is a possible ta'zir, then of course striking them more than 10 times is even more worthy to be permissible. If the punisher does what he is ordered to do, and he strikes with appropriate force, using the appropriate equipment, and everything is done in place, and this had punishment leads to death, then is the punisher held responsible? The answer is no, because of the general qaida which we have, مَا تَرَتَّبَ عَلَى الْمَأْذُونِ فَهُوَ غَيْرُ مَضْمُونٍ. Whatever results from something which is permissible, then nobody stands as a guarantor. And this had punishment was far from permissible, it was obligatory. So if anything results from this in terms of damages, then he does not stand as a guarantor. So if the punisher gives 101 whips, for example, and the person dies, then he's a guarantor. If he strikes too hard, then he's a guarantor. If he uses an incredibly strong material, like a metal rod of sorts, then he stands as a guarantor as well. What about if the person to be punished is extremely weak or is suffering a particular illness? Well, we could wait for him to recover from the illness, but if he's not going to recover, or maybe he is old, and we fear that giving him the had punishment like this is going to take his life, so his life will be on the line, then in this case what we could do is, instead of giving him 100 lashes, we could gather 100 sticks together and make it into one stick and give him one lash. And that's how Allah Jalla wa Ala ordered Ayyub alayhi salam to do to his wife. What about if the zani is being stoned to death? Do we need to dig a hole for him to be in that hole as he's stoned to death or not? Well, the narration of Ma'iz, which is coming up, it has different wordings. Some say that the hole was not dug up and some say it was dug up. So we have a difference of opinion amongst the scholars here, but what seems to be sensible is that we'll leave that decision down to the ijtihad of the Imam. Let's take this first hadith in the chapter, hadith 1048. Let's go straight to the translation because it's a longer narration. It's from Abu Huraira and Zayd ibn Khalid al-Juhani radiyallahu anhuma. They say that a man from the Arab, from the Bedouin Arab, came to the Prophet and he said, O Messenger of Allah, I beseech you that you judge my case for me using the book of Allah. And another man who was with this Arabi, he was more understanding than the other man. He said, yes, judge between us using the book of Allah and give me permission to speak. So the Prophet said, okay, speak. And the man said that my son was a worker for this other man, and he committed fornication with his wife. So the first man's son is working for the second man, and during his work he commits fornication with his employer's wife. And so the man narrating says that I was informed that my son is going to have to be stoned to death. So I gave a ransom for him, 100 sheep and a servant girl, in order to save him from the stoning. Then I asked the people of knowledge, and they informed me that my son is to receive 100 lashes and to be banished from the land which he is in for 1 year, and that the wife of this other man, meaning the employer's wife, she is to be stoned to death. And to this the Prophet said, by the one who has my soul in his hand, I will surely judge between you both using the book of Allah. And then he says that the servant girl and the sheep, meaning the 100 sheep, are to be returned back to you. And your son is to receive 100 lashes, and he is to be banished from the land in which he is in for 1 year. Of course, that's 1 lunar year. And then he said to his companion, Unais, he says, وَغْدُوا يَا أُنَيْسِ, in the morning, O Unais, set out إِلَى امْرَأَةِ هَذَا, to this man's wife, فَإِنِ اعْتَرَفَتْ فَرْجُمْهَا, and if she confesses that she did commit zina, then stone her. مُتَّفَقٌ عَلَيْهِ وَهَذَا اللَّفْظُ لِمُسْلِمٍ. This hadith is muttafaqun alayh, and the wording is of Muslim. So in this hadith we find evidence of what happens when somebody commits zina, whether this is fornication or adultery. And this is a valuable hadith to know about because of the benefits from this hadith. As zina is when you have sexual intercourse outside marriage, whether it be in the front passage or the back passage. So even if a person has intercourse in the back passage of a woman he's not married to, this would still be zina. Because at least the front passage can be halal through a nikah contract, a valid one of course, but the back passage is never ever halal in any circumstance, whether within marriage or outside marriage. And this penetration is done with a living human as opposed to a dead one, and the penetration is that the head of the front passage enters the female front passage, and both of these sexual organs are asli, original ones, because some hermaphrodites could have both male and female organs. So a woman may have a male organ, but this male organ is an extra. It is not the original organ. So what we are talking about is the original organ. So is just contact between the two sexual organs counted as zina? The answer is no. The minimum is that the head needs to penetrate. Just note here, in this narration, we have a case of zina taking place during the time of the Prophet. Now just ask yourself, if that's the case during the time of the Prophet, and these people are companions of the Prophet, because they enter the definition of the companion of the Prophet, so if this is happening amongst some of the companions of the Prophet, then what would be your opinion, O listener, akramakallah, about Muslims nowadays, more than 1400 years after the time of the Prophet? Zina is likely to be 1,000,000 times more widespread. Notice here what the man says to the Prophet. He says, I beseech you to judge using the book of Allah, as if there's a chance that the Prophet may not judge using the book of Allah Jalla wa Ala. So what does this tell us about this man? Well, it tells us that he is ignorant, simply, and this is understandable because he's an Arabi. He's a Bedouin Arab who lives in the countryside far away from the people of knowledge. And you can expect these ignorant remarks from these people. Allah Jalla wa Ala comments on them. He says, الأعراب أشد كفرا ونفاقا وأجدر ألا يعلموا حدود ما أنزل الله على رسوله والله عليم حكيم. The Arab, the Bedouins, are the worst in disbelief and hypocrisy, and they are more likely to be in ignorance of the limits or the laws which Allah has sent down onto His Messenger, and Allah is the knowledgeable and wise. The other man, however, was more understanding, so he had a better understanding, as is narrated there in the narration, because at least he said to the Prophet, give me permission to speak. And this is from his fiqh, or his understanding, that he does have some etiquettes before the Prophet ﷺ. And this is why the narrators of the hadith, Abu Huraira and Zayd ibn Khalid al-Juhani, they say that the second man had a better understanding. It's because he asked the Prophet permission to speak. We take the fa'idah from this hadith, the dangers of mixed gatherings, especially in the workplace. And if this is the case during the time of the Sahaba, which was the best generation of course, then what would be your opinion, O listener, akramakallah, about our times, in which people take mixed gatherings lightly, and it's all normal. But with Allah Jalla wa Ala, this is not normal. Thus, the Muslims must make great efforts to separate between the genders as much as is possible. We take from this hadith as well the danger of listening to people who do not have proper knowledge about Islamic rulings. because in the first instance the man was told that his son is to be stoned to death. Now imagine if you were to carry out this ruling. You would be killing somebody who does not deserve to be killed. And this is of course an irreversible mistake. So we find then the danger of listening to people who don't have knowledge. And giving a ruling without knowledge is speaking against Allah Jalla wa Ala without due knowledge. And this is a major sin. Allah Jalla wa Ala gives a warning in the Quran against this sort of behavior. He says, قُلْ إِنَّمَا حَرَّمَ رَبِّيَ الْفَوَاحِشَ مَا ظَهَرَ مِنْهَا وَمَا بَطَنَ وَالْإِثْمَ وَالْبَغْيَ بِغَيْرِ الْحَقِّ وَأَن تُشْرِكُوا بِاللَّهِ مَا لَمْ يُنَزِّلْ بِهِ سُلْطَانًا وَأَن تَقُولُوا عَلَى اللَّهِ مَا لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. Say, my Lord has only forbidden al-fawahish, what appears thereof and what is hidden, and sin and transgression without due right, and that you should associate partners with Allah, for which you have no evidence, and that you should speak against Allah without knowledge. And so from this hadith then, we find the virtue of the people of knowledge, because when you ask them, then they will be able to guide you correctly. We find here that the Prophet takes an oath that he will judge using the Book of Allah, but the Prophet was not asked to take an oath. So we can say that you can take an oath without being asked to take an oath if the situation is serious enough to demand it. This narration is extremely important because it proves beyond doubt that the punishment for adultery is stoning to death. And the reason why this is such an important hadith is because you are guaranteed to find some quote-unquote Muslims who will tell you that the adulterer is not stoned to death because there's no evidence for this in the Quran. Well, that's true, there's no evidence in the Quran, but the Quran is not the only source of law. The hadith are also sources of law in the Sharia, and so we have evidence from the hadith. We can also take from this hadith that any wealth which is taken from his owner without due right must be returned, because here the Prophet tells him that the 100 sheep and the servant girl are returned back to you. And from this we can take that bid'ah is to be rejected and its presence is like its absence, so it's as if it never occurred, meaning to say that you are not rewarded for it. Because this idea of giving the 100 sheep and the servant girl in return for somebody who committed adultery, then the Prophet said that all of this must be returned, so it really is of no effect. And so from this we find that the had punishments cannot be changed or substituted, and that this would be a bid'ah which is to be rejected, because the Prophet rejected this idea of giving the 100 sheep and the servant girl, because this is not the had punishment for adultery. And so nowadays we may find some people wanting to change the had punishments in order to appease the kuffar, or in order to appease their own desires, as the case may be. Well, the point is that anything which replaces the had punishment must be rejected, just as the Prophet rejected the alternative here. So if you have taken somebody else's wealth without due right, you must return it. If you are unable to do so, then you give it in charity on his behalf. But will you be taken into account in the hereafter for taking his wealth? Well, we say that if you have sincerely repented, then you will not be taken into account. We learn also that with regards to zina and not adultery, the punishment is twofold. Firstly, it is 100 lashes, and secondly, it is to banish that person from his land. So he goes to another land in which he will not be influenced in committing this act of zina again. So the idea is to change his environment, because the environment which he is in currently will encourage him to commit zina. And the evidence is because he has committed zina, so it is likely that he may do it again. So the idea is to change his environment in which he is a stranger to that place, and that will make it more difficult for him to commit zina. But of course, that place to which you are banishing him must be an upright place. So if you're banishing him in a place in which zina is widespread, then this of course defeats the whole purpose. So in a case like this then, when you cannot find any suitable place, then you do not banish this person. Rather, he could be imprisoned. We also take from this hadith that it is permissible to appoint somebody to carry out the had punishment on your behalf. So the Imam can appoint somebody to carry out the had punishment, as the Prophet here appointed Unais to go and see that if this woman will confess or not, and if she does, then he can carry out the had punishment. We can also take from this hadith that repeating the confession 3 times more, so a total of 4 times, is not obligatory, and rather just one confession would suffice, because the Prophet told him to see if she confesses. He did not tell him to see if she confesses 4 times. And these punishments here, about the stoning to death and the lashing of 100 and the banishment, these apply to free people. They do not apply to servants. And with regards to the servants, male and female, there is a difference in the punishment which they receive. And there's also the discussion, does the female servant receive the same punishment as the male servant? But this is something we will talk about later on, inshallah. One might ask a question at this point. The Prophet sent Unais to see if this woman will confess. Now there seems to be a problem. Do we go around asking people to confess to committing zina? Sure, if a person comes to us and he tells us that he committed zina and he wants the punishment to be established on him as a kafara for his sin, so he does not have to take the punishment in the hereafter, then this is fair enough, we would establish the punishment on him. But would we go out of our way to seek a confession from somebody we suspect may have committed zina? How is this right and proper? Well, we say generally we do not go out seeking a confession from people at all. And that if somebody does commit zina, they come to us and confess because they want to repent and they want to be purified from their sins. But we certainly do not send anyone to go out and confess to committing zina, even if we suspect somebody may have committed zina. No, suspicion is not good enough. But then this begs the question, why did the Prophet send Unais out? Because from our scenario here, the only thing which has been definitely established is that the worker did commit zina. This much has been established. And if somebody was to ask, well, how did the Prophet judge against this worker when the worker was not present? Rather, it was the other man, the father of the worker, who was speaking. Well, we can say that it is very possible that the son of the father, meaning the worker, he was present during this situation, meaning when the case was being heard. So it's not like the Prophet is judging against him in his absence. But as for the woman, she definitely was not present, we know that, because the Prophet told Unais to go out in the morning and seek a confession from her. So she definitely was not present. Yet the Prophet is telling Unais to go out of his way and seek a confession, which goes against our general principle that you do not go out seeking confessions from people if you suspect that they have committed zina. And the answer to this doubtful matter is that the only reason why the Prophet did send Unais to go out and seek a confession is because this issue of the zina, which ought to be kept secret in society, we don't want fahisha to be spread out and open in the society. If it does occur, it must be suppressed and kept secret, so that even if the fahisha does occur, it is not out in the open and it is not public knowledge, because in an Islamic society, we don't want acts of zina to be public. And this is one of the reasons we don't go around asking people to confess if they've committed zina, if we suspect that they have committed zina. We don't do that. We must suppress these instances of zina so they don't become public and out in the open. But here the Prophet did do this because it is likely then that this knowledge or this news that this man committing zina with the employer's wife had become widespread. So there simply is no way of suppressing this news. So now that it has become widespread and unavoidable in the public sphere, the Prophet had to send Unais to go out and seek a confession so that the punishment can be established, so that because this news has become widespread, everybody can see what the effects of adultery is. And it is the stoning to death. Because if you were to leave this woman alone, then people would start to think, oh, well, adultery is fine, and there's no serious punishment for adultery, and this is likely to encourage adultery in the society. So it's only because the news must have become public knowledge that the Prophet had to send Unais out to seek a confession. Otherwise, the general rule is you do not do this. Rather, the punishment is only established on the one for whom you have evidence for that he has committed zina in the court, not just mere suspicion. And also you do not judge against anyone in their absence. We also take from this hadith that if somebody is to be stoned to death, he is not whipped 100 lashes beforehand. There would be no benefit in this. and that this idea of whipping him and then stoning him to death is abrogated. Rather, you just stone to death. Also, we can take if somebody does something wrong out of ignorance, then he's not to be punished for this, because this man gave the 100 sheep and the servant girl as a fidya, and the Prophet did not punish him for this misguided act. And the reason is because the man was ignorant. After all, he is a Bedouin Arab. As for the stoning and the whipping, well, this is fitting because this person who committed zina, he experienced this forbidden pleasure in the whole of his body. And so therefore it is fitting that he should experience the pain of his sin on the whole of his body. And this is why the whipping is to be done all across the body, only avoiding the parts you have to avoid, of course. And likewise the stoning to death, it is pain across the whole of the body. And so like this, the punishment fits the sin. And one of the reasons for the difference in punishment between fornication and adultery is because with the adulterer, Allah Jalla wa Ala has given him the ni'mah of having lawful sexual intercourse with a wife. And this is a ni'mah from Allah Jalla wa Ala. But yet, despite this ni'mah, he still commits this sin. And this makes this sin of zina even more ugly than it already is. At least the person who is unmarried, you could understand why he might have committed zina. His desires overcame him. Still, it's not acceptable, of course, but it's less ugly than the adulterer. And every decent person knows this intrinsically. As for the adulterer, he has to be a muhsan to be stoned to death. And what this means is that he is a free person and a mukallaf, and he has had sexual intercourse in the front passage in a valid nikah contract. So note then, he does not even have to be presently married. As long as he fits that criteria, he is a muhsan and subject to the stoning. Okay, let's take some review questions. So question number 1. Explain what we mean by had linguistically and technically. Question number 2. What are the conditions for the had to be applied to a person? Question number 3. The only hadith which we have discussed in this track explains to us that whoever does an action not in accordance with this matter of ours is rejected. Explain how this is the case with regards to the hadith which we discussed in the track.